Hello and welcome everybody. This is Grandmaster Sam Shankland, and I have received more messages than I can count from a lot of different people saying they really want a series on the Caro-Kann, and I've decided it's finally time to give them what they want. So we're gonna get started. So the Caro-Kann defense is characterized by when White plays e4, which is a very common opening move, which gains space in the center and controlling the e5 and f5 squares and opens up lines for the bishop and the queen, and it's just a very common opening move. Black has a lot of ways to respond. There's e5, which is a symmetrical game. There's e6, which is the French defense, hoping to counter with d5. There's c5, which is the Sicilian, and there's some other miscellaneous ones that I won't mention, but the one we're going to look at today is the Caro-Kann defense, c6. So, at first sight, this does not look enormously logical, because it seems like, well, White's advanced a pawn 2 squares, we've advanced at 1, but while we advanced at 1 square, we're also blocking the square that our knight might really like to go to on c6. And we haven't opened up any lines for any of our pieces except for this one for the queen, but it seems a little bit dubious. But then we'll see the real point, which is that Black is hoping to strike back in the center with d5. So let's say White plays the normal move, d4, to gain more space in the center, open up more lines. Black will immediately strike back with d5. And now he's putting pressure on White's center right away. So I know there's a series already on chess.com where it's suggested for White to capture on d5, but I think this already is immediately playing into Black's hands, because after c takes d5, we're seeing the point. Black now has 2 central pawns, and White only has 1. And already, I believe Black has an entirely adequate game. I mean, okay, White should almost certainly try to play a little more aggressively than that series and play c4, but in any case, we'll go over some of that stuff later. For now, I'm just sort of trying to give you the basic feel of it. So after d4, d5, Black has opened up a line for his bishop, and he's trying to take his own stake in the center from the side, while not creating a completely symmetrical position so that he has chances to create some dynamism. And what I really like about the Caro-Kann is very solid. It's a good way to fight for equality right away, but it's also not like a boring, I'll shake your hand with a draw kind of equality. It's an equality where, if you realize it, you'll always have a little bit of something to play for. So, in any case, this is the main starting position of the Caro-Kann, and there's a million different moves here. The old main line is knight to c3, which defends the pawn on e4. There is f3, which is sort of the fantasy variation. I actually already covered a video on this once. There is e5, the advanced variation, which I think is the most challenging variation around nowadays. There's e takes d5 with the Panov after c4. I've covered a few games that I've played in this variation too. And other miscellaneous, White has other moves in this position. He can play knight c3, d5, and knight f3. This is the 2 knights. And really, there's literally just a ton of different tries. So I'm not going to go into every single one in tons of detail, but I'm going to try to give you a relatively sound repertoire that you can rely on. So in the first video here, I'd like to discuss just some sidelines that I think we should get out of the way first. They're sort of more of it's options that maybe you'll see at the club level that are kind of tricky but really aren't going to do any serious damage. And then we'll do a video on the main line and on the advance and then on the Panov, and we'll do some more of the meaty stuff. So let's start with the sideline that goes knight c3, d5, knight f3. This is known as the 2 knights variation of the Caro-Kann. And I've actually played this once in my life. Maybe more than once, actually, but I've had some pretty good results. But realistically, Black has nothing to fear. So, essentially, Black has a few options. The problem is, it's a little bit awkward for him to find a good move. Because let's say he plays knight f6, which looks like a natural move, putting pressure on the center. White will strike back with e5, and now the knight probably should go to d7, and now d4. And the problem is Black would really like to attack this d4 pawn with c5 somehow, but in order to do that, he's probably got to play e6. And now we have a French defense down a tempo, and I don't think that's what anybody wants here. The main point of the Caro-Kann is that if you compare it to the French defense, sorry, this is going a little bit backtrack, but the French defense starts e4, e6, d4, d5, And there's a lot of similar moves, knight d2, knight c3, and e5, namely. But basically, the French defense would make more sense at first glance because you've played e6, which leaves the square open for your knight and opens up this bishop. But the problem is you're left with this chronically bad French bishop on c8 who's never capable of going outside this pawn chain on e6. So when you play the Caro-Kann, your point is you might be a little bit slower, but you want to develop your bishop before playing e6. So after this idea, knight c3, d5, knight f3, if we play knight f6, after e5, knight g4, d4, what we'd really like to do is play bishop jumps over knight on f5 and then e6. But we can't quite do that, and this is an awkward situation. So the move I recommend is bishop to g4. I think this is a very strong move. So white now plays h3. And black has a few options, or two really. He can take the knight or retreat the bishop. I'm going to recommend that black captures the knight. And then queen takes f3, e6. So the point is we sort of have a kind of French defense structure here. But we've exchanged off our bad bishop. And now white has the bishop here, but they're not particularly active yet. And I think black has a very natural plan to develop his pieces. I'd recommend fianchettoing the king's bishop. So, for example, say, I think white's best move here is d3. And now knight d7. And a lot of the time white will play a3 just to stop bishop b4. In fact, maybe he could even play bishop b4 here. I don't know. That's something you could look up on your own. I've never really put too much thought into that. But after something like a3, knight d7, d3, I'd recommend fianchettoing this bishop on g7. And I think no matter how white develops, black has a few options that should lead him to a totally equal position. Say g3, white also tries to fianchetto, bishop g7, bishop g2. Black can develop his knight to either e7 or f6, castle short or long, and have a fine position. If I had to pick one option, I would probably say develop the knight to e7 and castle short. And we get some position like this, and I think black should be absolutely fine. He has a good stake in the center, his pieces are all well placed, and this bishop on g2 is not the best piece ever. Black can start thinking about trying to expand with b5, a5, b4, and look for queenside play. And, well, I believe black should be absolutely fine. I don't really know of any other options white has here. If he plays d4, he's just going to ask for trouble. To give an example, let's say d4 here. First of all, I will say I have not yet seen a direct refutation to takes, and queen takes d4, clipping a central pawn. But this looks very risky to me. I wouldn't really recommend it. It seems somehow looks like too much. I'd want to play the move knight to f6. And the point is after e5, which looks more or less forced because, well, eventually this e-pawn is going to get captured. White could play some kind of move like bishop d3, but after just takes, black has a couple options. He again could try to take on d4, which I think makes a little bit more sense this time because the d file is shut down, but even if he doesn't want to, after takes, and now queen takes, knight d7, black will quickly drop the knight over to f6. So let's say c3, knight f6, queen f3, bishop e7. In general, a position like this one should be absolutely fine for black. It looks a little strange because white has more space and the bishop pair, but the point is the bishops aren't so active yet. Black has absolutely no weaknesses, and he can hope to attack the center. His moves sort of play themselves. Castle, queen b6, some rook to d8, and plays c5. And I think this position's absolutely fine for black as well. And we'll see some more positions like these later. White, essentially, if he wants to really fight, has to come in with a little bit more of an aggressive attitude. In any case, let's say white tries a move like e5. After knight d7, black will simply now play c5, knight c6, and break down the entire white pawn center. And I think black actually could have good chances for an advantage already. So that's sort of the two knights variation. I should mention there's some other goofy line that goes takes, knight e5, hanging the queen, takes, bishop b5 check, and in theory this is kind of annoying, but realistically it's just, I think, more or less winning for black. So it goes knight c6, takes, and now you just have to find one good move, queen b6, and black is simply winning. You have to be a little careful. I mean, there are moves you could make that would mess up here, but after queen b6, I think black just wins. And to give a sample variation, in case you're wondering, let's say like knight takes d5. At this point, black's up a huge amount of material. He actually sacrifices the queen back with queen takes b5. Of course, white has to play knight c7 to recapture the queen, but after simply king d7, take, and then b takes c6. At the end here, black is up a piece and completely winning. So that's sort of the two knights variation. The next variation I'd like to cover is this sort of weird knight e2 move. And the point of this move is he wants to get an advanced variation without playing d4. So here, d5, e5, and there's a lot of possible moves here, but I would recommend a very principled approach, which says, well, if white is going to try to play an advance and wait on d4, we can punish him for that. So a typical move for the advanced variation would be bishop to f5. But here we see some annoyance. Knight g3 hits the bishop, and then h4. And we'll get into some very similar positions to these in later videos, but I'll tell you now, there's at least some annoyance here, although I think black's still fine. In any case, the move I'm going to recommend is d4, which immediately precludes white from ever playing d4 himself. And black will quickly follow up with c5, knight c6, and he'll have a quite fine position in my view. So, for example, let's say c3, c5, d3, knight c6, probably white has to play f4. And black has a few options here, but let's say even a move like h5 looks logical to me to try to control some white squares, and black will play knight h6, bishop f5, and his pieces all seem to find good squares. I think that black is absolutely fine. Meanwhile, the white bishop on c1 and bishop on f1 are less than desirable. I don't think black's necessarily better, but black is at the very least comfortable. So, other sidelines for white, there's some, if he wants to get really random, he could play a move like b3. But after d5, simply taking the pawn is quite acceptable. And white will play queen e2, bishop f5, and I think black will simply hold on to the pawn and have a good position here. So that's not really a very viable sideline, but I have seen it played before, so I figured I'd mention it. Yeah, d3, d5, and knight d2 is another sideline that I've seen before. So here white's trying to set up a King's Indian attack. Like, for example, if black were to play something like knight f6, he might continue e5, knight d7, knight f3, e6, g3, bishop e7, bishop g2, castle, castle, c5. I think it'd be like rook e1, knight c6, knight f1. And here white has a pretty standard King's Indian attack. And this is the kind of thing that, well, in general, I think that these kinds of positions are okay, but I'm not sure that we need to allow this, and white also does have a key tempo. So here white has sort of a built-in attacking plan, h4, knight h2, knight g4. In any case, I don't think we will have any reason to allow this, and I believe in a principled approach which says that if we have a chance to prevent someone from doing something, we should do it. And in this case, I believe if white is going to play these kinds of moves, we will simply strike back and take the entire center away from him. And I think this is a very nice idea. So already I think black is equalized very comfortably, and I think he can even hope to start playing for an advantage. So after, I think white's mainly playing like knight f3 here. It's less accurate to play g3, because I think the setup black would really like is to play g6. In this case, we're going to have a double fianchetto, where black is simply more active because he's taken the center with e5. This would, I think, favor black quite nicely. So what white would really like to do is not allow this symmetry by playing knight to f3. And here probably black should play bishop d6. And the point is now, not that the bishop on d6 is necessarily poorly placed, but white has at least a little bit more chance to play d4 or something like that, because the pieces are situated in such a way. In fact, I think d4 is the best move here. But after a simple e takes d4, I think black has a totally fine position. Let's say e takes d5, and now I think a strong move, knight to c6, or knight to f6, excuse me, is very nice. After e takes d5, I think maybe after knight d4, white can, well, it's a pretty typical IQP, and I think black has a decent position, but I think white can fight for an edge. In any case, after knight f6, this pawn is attacked, and if white were to capture on c6, first of all, I think actually gambiting some pawns with castle short is quite interesting, to try to quickly get rook e8 and develop your pieces. For example, if white tries to hold on to his material, like cb, rook e8, bishop b7, castle, somehow this looks like black could organize a very strong attack very quickly. but I don't know, some kind of knight g4 here or something. In any case, I don't think this is necessary. I would simply prefer to recapture this pawn. And we've got the same isolated queen pawn type position, except we have two tempi ahead in development to the one we saw before. And as a result, I don't think white has any chance to really make the isolated queen pawn felt. So this, I believe, is entirely fine for black. And okay, white could capture on d4, and then black has a few options. He can again castle, gambiting the pawn to try to attack, but I'd also say just simply knight takes d5. We'll leave black with a totally fine position. It's a little bit dry, which could annoy some players who are trying to play for a win, but if it's any consolation, I've only reached this position once against a pretty solid IM, and I won without too much trouble. So, anyhow, I think with all this in mind, we can think about concluding part one. To sort of leave you off by showing where we're going to go next, we've covered all the sidelines and sort of the random lines today. So I think the next thing that we should cover is going to be one of the main lines, or so it's the more main lines, but it's still, we're going to sort of cover them in order of how difficult they are, so that, because I think that's just the best way to do things. So our next video is going to cover the fantasy variation, f3, which I think is better than it's maybe given credit for, but it's still not such a great move, but I would call it a mainline. So we're going to cover that one next, and until then, this is Sam Shankland signing off.